January 17, 1945. Somewhere over the Philippine Sea. The air smelled of salt and engine oil. At 14,000 feet, the world below was nothing but an endless mirror of gray-blue water, broken only by the white scars of waves. Inside the cockpit of a Douglas C-47 Skytrain, Captain James "Jimmy" Harlan could feel the vibrations of the twin Pratt & Whitney engines humming through his boots, up his spine, into his skull. His hands, calloused and steady, gripped the yoke with the kind of quiet confidence that came not from bravery but from repetition. Behind him, pressed shoulder to shoulder in the dim cargo bay, sat 32 wounded American soldiers, men with shrapnel in their legs, men with burns across their chests, men who had survived the hell of Luzon only to find themselves suspended between earth and sky, trusting their lives to a man they'd never met and a machine held together by rivets and prayer. The radio crackled, static. Then a voice, distant and distorted from the USS Mindoro Bay below. "Skytrain 79er, you are cleared for approach. Wind at 12 knots east-southeast. Deck is yours." Jimmy nodded to no one. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Frank Delaney, a kid from Iowa with freckles and a farm boy grin, flipped through the checklist with fingers that trembled just slightly. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say. They had done this before. 43 times to be exact. 43 landings on escort carriers, those floating postage stamps the Navy called jeep carriers, where the runway was 500 feet of steel deck and the margin for error was measured in inches. 43 times Jimmy had brought his plane down, delivered his cargo of broken men, and lifted off again into the infinite Pacific sky. But this time was different. This time, the world was about to ask him to do something no one had ever done before. In the winter of 1945, the war in the Pacific had entered its final, brutal chapter. American forces were island-hopping toward Japan, and every mile gained was paid for in blood. The fighting on Luzon, the largest island in the Philippines, had been particularly savage. Japanese forces, dug into caves and bunkers, fought with the ferocity of men who believed surrender was worse than death. American casualties mounted daily. Field hospitals overflowed. Wounded soldiers, some with minutes left to live, needed evacuation. They needed to reach the hospital ships anchored offshore. They needed to reach them fast. That's where men like Jimmy Harlan came in. The C-47 Skytrain was never designed to land on a carrier. It was a cargo plane, a workhorse, built to haul supplies and paratroopers over long distances. Its wingspan stretched 95 feet. Its landing speed hovered around 70 miles per hour. Carriers, by contrast, were designed for fighters and torpedo bombers, sleek, fast machines that could stop on a dime with the help of arresting cables. The idea of landing a lumbering twin-engine transport plane on a carrier deck was, to most pilots, insane, suicidal, a stunt reserved for daredevils and madmen. But the war didn't care about sanity. The war cared about results. And so, in late 1944, a small group of Army Air Forces pilots, Jimmy among them, had volunteered to attempt the impossible. They trained in secret, practicing short field landings on runways marked with tape to simulate carrier dimensions. They studied wind patterns, approach angles, the physics of deceleration. They learned to trust their instincts because instruments could only tell you so much when you were dropping out of the sky toward a moving target the size of a city block. By January 1945, Jimmy had become one of the best. He could feel the plane in his bones. He knew when it wanted to drift left, when it wanted to nose up, when the wind would catch the tail and try to slew him sideways. He had landed in rain, in fog, in the failing light of dusk. He had landed with one engine coughing, with hydraulic fluid leaking, with wounded men screaming in the back. But he had never landed with no deck at all. The call came at 14:20 hours. Jimmy was 30 miles out, descending through a thin layer of clouds when the radio barked to life again. This time, the voice was different, sharper, urgent. "Skytrain 79er, abort approach. Repeat, abort approach. Deck is fouled. We have a crash. Fire crews engaged.
Do not, repeat, do not attempt landing." Jimmy's jaw tightened. Frank looked at him, eyes wide. "What do we do?" Jimmy didn't answer. He banked the plane gently, circling away from the carrier, and scanned the horizon. His fuel gauge read just under a quarter tank, enough for maybe 40 minutes of flight time, maybe 50 if he leaned the mixture and prayed the headwinds stayed calm. Below, the Mindoro Bay was a gray smudge on the water, wreathed in smoke. He could see the orange flicker of flames on the flight deck. Another plane, an F-6F Hellcat by the look of it, had crashed on landing, its wreckage blocking the entire runway. The deck crew swarmed like ants, dragging hoses, spraying foam, hauling twisted metal out of the way. It would take time, maybe an hour, maybe more. Jimmy didn't have an hour.
Behind him, in the cargo bay, a medic named Corporal Eddie Vasquez moved between the wounded. Eddie was 22, a high school dropout from East LA who had lied about his age to enlist. He had kind eyes and hands that never stopped moving, checking pulses, adjusting bandages, whispering reassurances in English and Spanish. He knew, better than anyone, how fragile these men were. 3 of them had chest wounds. 2 had lost so much blood that their skin had gone the color of old newspaper. 1, a kid named Private First Class Timothy Rourke from Boston, had taken shrapnel to the abdomen and was slipping in and out of consciousness. Eddie had done what he could, but Rourke needed surgery. Real surgery, the kind you couldn't do in the back of a plane with a morphine syringe and a prayer. Eddie made his way forward, crouching low to avoid the overhead cables, and tapped Jimmy on the shoulder. "Captain," he said, voice low, "we got a problem. Rourke's bleeding internally. I can't stop it. He needs a hospital. Now." Jimmy nodded. His mind was already moving, sorting through options like cards in a deck. He could divert to another carrier. The Santee was 50 miles south, but 50 miles meant another 15 minutes in the air, and there was no guarantee the Santee's deck would be clear. He could ditch in the ocean, hope a destroyer picked them up before the plane sank, but a water landing with wounded men, in these seas, half of them would drown before the rescue boats arrived. Or he could do something no one had ever done. He could land on the Mindoro Bay's stern. The stern of an escort carrier was not a runway. It was a parking lot, a flat, open space behind the superstructure where planes were stored, maintained, refueled. It was maybe 200 feet long, half the length of the normal flight deck, and cluttered with equipment, fuel drums, tool carts, tie-down chains. It was never meant to be a landing zone. It couldn't be a landing zone. The math didn't work. A C-47 needed at least 300 feet to stop, even with full brakes and reverse thrust. 200 feet? That was a death sentence. But Jimmy wasn't thinking about the math. He was thinking about Private Rourke bleeding out in the back. He was thinking about the other 31 men who had survived machine gun fire and mortar rounds and malaria, only to die because a plane had crashed in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was thinking about the promise he had made to himself the first time he climbed into a cockpit, that he would get his people home, no matter what. He keyed the radio. "Mindoro Bay, this is Skytrain 79er. I'm coming in." A pause. Then, "Negative 79er. Deck is still fouled. Hold your position." "Copy that. I'm not landing on the deck. I'm landing on the stern." Silence. Long enough that Jimmy thought maybe the radio had died. Then, "Say again, 79er? "The stern. Clear me a path and I'll put her down behind the island. I've got wounded dying back here. I don't have time to wait." Another pause. Longer this time. Jimmy could almost hear the debate happening on the bridge, the risk assessment, the insurance calculations, the inevitable conclusion that what he was proposing was not just dangerous, but impossible. Finally, "Skytrain 79er, you're out of your goddamn mind." Jimmy smiled. It was a thin, humorless smile, the kind you wear when you've already made your mind and you're just waiting for the world to catch up. "Probably, but I'm doing it anyway. Clear the stern. Stand by." Frank was staring at him. "Jimmy, you can't be serious. We'll never stop in time. We'll roll right off the edge." "Not if I do it right." "And if you don't?" Jimmy didn't answer. He pushed the yoke forward, nosing the plane down, and began his approach.
Below, the Mindoro Bay grew larger, its stern now a rectangle of gray steel framed by the endless blue. He could see sailors running, dragging equipment out of the way, waving their arms in frantic gestures that might have been encouragement or might have been warnings to stay the hell away. He didn't care. His world had narrowed to a tunnel, the yoke in his hands, the horizon in his windshield, the hum of the engines, and the invisible thread connecting him to that patch of deck. He dropped the flaps, full down. The plane shuddered, slowing, wallowing in the air like a drunk trying to walk a straight line. His airspeed bled off. 80 knots, 75, 70. He was dancing on the edge of a stall, the plane threatening to drop out of the sky if he let the speed fall any further. The carrier loomed. The stern was right there, dead ahead, impossibly small, a postage stamp on the surface of the ocean. 50 feet, 30, 20.
He cut the throttle. The engines coughed, sputtered, went silent. For a moment, the only sound was the wind screaming past the fuselage and the groaning of the airframe as the plane sank toward the deck. Then, contact. The wheels hit steel with a bang that rattled Jimmy's teeth. The brakes screamed. The tire shrieked. The plane lurched, skidded, fishtailed left, then right. Jimmy fought the yoke, hauling it back, stomping the rudder pedals, willing the plane to stop, to hold, to stay on the damn deck. They were sliding. 50 feet to go. 40, 30. The edge of the stern was right there. Beyond it, nothing but open air and a 100-foot drop to the water. 20 feet. 10. The plane shuddered, groaned, and stopped. The nose wheel hung 6 inches over the edge. 6 inches. Jimmy exhaled. He hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath. His hands were shaking. Frank was laughing, a high, hysterical sound that might have been relief or terror or both. Behind them, the cargo bay erupted in cheers, weak, ragged cheers from men who had just realized they were going to live. Eddie appeared in the cockpit doorway, face pale, eyes bright. "Captain," he said, voice hoarse, "you're either the craziest son of a bitch I've ever met, or the bravest. I can't decide which." Jimmy unbuckled his harness, stood, and looked out the windscreen at the 6 inches of air between his plane and oblivion. "Ask me again when we take off," he said. The deck crew swarmed the plane within seconds. Stretchers appeared. The wounded were carried off, one by one, into the bowels of the ship where surgeons and nurses were already prepping operating rooms. Private Rourke, barely conscious, was the first to go. He would survive. They all would. 32 men, pulled from the edge of death by a pilot who had bet everything on 6 inches of clearance, and won. But Jimmy's mission wasn't over, not yet. The fire on the main deck was out. The wreckage had been cleared. The Mindoro Bay was ready to receive aircraft again, but the C-47 was still parked on the stern, blocking the hangar access, and there was no way to tow it forward without a flight deck tractor, which was currently on the other side of the ship, which meant Jimmy had one option: take off from the stern. Another impossibility, another insane gamble. A C-47 needed at least 500 feet to get airborne. The stern was 200. But the Navy had a trick up its sleeve. The carrier could steam into the wind, adding 20 knots of relative airspeed to the plane's takeoff roll. Combined with full power and a prayer, it might be enough. Jimmy climbed back into the cockpit. Frank was already there, running the pre-flight checks, flipping switches with the mechanical precision of a man who had decided that if he was going to die, he might as well die doing his job. The engines coughed to life. The propellers spun. The deck crew signaled, "Wind is good, you're clear, go now." Jimmy released the brakes. The plane lurched forward. He shoved the throttles to full power. The engines roared. The plane accelerated, faster, faster, eating up the deck in huge, hungry gulps. 100 feet, 150. The edge of the stern was rushing toward them. Jimmy pulled back on the yoke. The nose lifted. The wheels left the deck. For a moment, one terrible, infinite moment, the plane hung in the air, neither flying nor falling, suspended by physics and hope and the sheer bloody-minded refusal of a pilot who had decided that today gravity would not win. And then the wings bit the air.
The plane climbed, slowly, grudgingly, but climbing. Jimmy banked left, circling back toward Luzon, and allowed himself one glance at the Mindoro Bay receding below. The sailors on deck were waving, their cheers lost in the wind and the engine noise, but Jimmy could feel them. He could feel the impossible weight of gratitude and disbelief and awe. Frank was grinning. "We did it," he said. "We actually did it." Jimmy nodded. He didn't trust himself to speak. Word of Jimmy Harlan's landing spread through the Pacific Fleet like wildfire. By nightfall, every pilot in the theater had heard the story. By the next day, it had reached General MacArthur's headquarters in Manila. By the end of the week, it was being discussed in Washington. Some called it reckless, others called it genius. A few, mostly the men whose lives he had saved, called it a miracle. But Jimmy didn't care about the labels. He flew 14 more missions before the war ended. He landed on 5 more carriers, though never again on a stern. After VJ Day, he returned to the States, traded his uniform for a pair of overalls, and spent the rest of his life flying crop dusters over the farmland of Nebraska. He never gave interviews, never wrote a memoir, never attended reunions or accepted awards.
But the men he saved never forgot. Every year, on January 17th, a small group of them, those who were still alive, would gather in a bar in San Diego, or a VFW hall in Boston, or a backyard in Los Angeles, and they would raise a glass to the pilot who had bet his life on 6 inches and won. They would tell the story to their children and grandchildren, embellishing some details, forgetting others, but always coming back to the same truth, that on a gray January day in 1945, when the world seemed to be running out of miracles, a pilot named Jimmy Harlan proved that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to fly toward the edge of the impossible and land anyway. They would raise their glasses, they would toast, and they would remember. Because in war, there are 1,000 ways to die and only a few ways to live forever. Jimmy Harlan had found one. He had taken a plane that shouldn't fly, landed it where it couldn't land, and saved lives that shouldn't have been saved. And in doing so, he had written his name, quietly, humbly, without fanfare, into the sky itself. A name carried on the wind and the salt spray, and the memory of men who owed him everything and could repay him nothing except the promise that they would never, ever forget. 6 inches. That's all it took. 6 inches between heroism and disaster, between life and death, between a pilot doing his job and a pilot becoming a legend. Jimmy Harlan chose heroism, and for 32 men, that choice made all the difference. Epilogue. There is a plaque today bolted to the bulkhead of a museum in Pensacola, Florida. It's small, easy to miss among the propellers and uniforms and faded photographs. But if you stop, if you read it, you'll find the story of Skytrain's 79er and the landing that should never have happened. You'll find the names of the 32 men who survived, and at the bottom, in letters worn smooth by the touch of 1,000 hands, you'll find this: to Captain James Harlan, who taught us that the edge of the impossible is just the beginning of the extraordinary. The kids who visit the museum don't always understand. They see the words, but they don't feel the weight. They don't know what it means to hang 6 inches over the void and trust that a man you've never met will hold you there, will fight the wind and the physics and the fear until he brings you home. But the old men know. The ones with white hair and gnarled hands who move slowly through the halls, leaning on canes, their chests heavy with medals they never wear. They know. They stop at the plaque. They touch the letters. And sometimes, if you're lucky, you'll see them smile. A small, secret smile, the kind that holds a lifetime of gratitude and loss and love. They know what Jimmy Harlan knew, that in the end, the measure of a man is not how high he flies, but how softly he lands, and that sometimes the craziest decision is the only one that makes any sense at all.